Morning, everyone. It's good to see everybody here today. It's about that time to get started. Glad everybody here is here when they are because of the time change. So, hope everyone was able to get a decent night's rest. But like I said, it's good to see everybody. Let's start with the word of prayer and then we'll get into our class. Yeah. Yeah. Do we? What's her mom's name? Do we know? Okay, that's fine. All right, well, we'll definitely lift her up in prayer this morning. So let's pray. Father in heaven, we approach your throne at this time. Just thank you for this time we have to enter into study. And Father, at this time, we'd like to lift up Amanda's mom to you and just pray that you bring comfort and strength to that situation and just ask that your will be done, Father, whatever that might be. And just thank you that we're able to bring these things before you in prayer, God, and just that we can take comfort in the fact that you care for us and love us and take concern in the struggles of this life. If I would just be with all those who are sick and struggling in whatever way, there's so many on our hearts and minds, and just pray that you also bring comfort and strength to those situations. Father, be with us now as we enter into this time of study, and just help us to clear our minds of any cares and concerns so that we might be able to absorb into our hearts the things that you have to teach us through your word. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, let's be opening our Bibles to the book of Proverbs. Today we're going to be concluding our study that we've been doing on practical wisdom from the Proverbs. But as you're turning to Proverbs, I'd just like to begin by reminding us of a verse we find in the New Testament. We're not going to go there. But over in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33, Paul said to his readers, "Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals." Again, we're not going there. But in that statement, and in a context dealing with the resurrection, the Apostle Paul brings out a very important principle in that statement. And the principle in that statement is that if we surround ourselves with the wrong people, our morality is something that can be corrupted and eventually destroyed. Now, I bring these things up because today, like I said, we're going to be concluding our study on the wisdom from the Proverbs. And we're going to look more closely at that principle of avoiding bad company and keeping good company from the perspective of the book of Proverbs. Now, I chose this topic to conclude our study of Proverbs that we've been doing because after looking at all the areas that we've looked at during the course of this study, the most important thing that I think we have to do is surround ourselves with people who will encourage us to employ the wisdom that we find in Proverbs in the way that we live our lives. And so what we're going to do today is consider for ourselves two reasons as to why we must make it a point to keep good company. And we're going to do this from the text of Proverbs chapter 1, verses 10 through 19. So if you'll be turning with me to that passage, that's Proverbs chapter 1, verses 10 through 19. Now, as I said, we're going to be looking at two reasons from this text as to why it's important to keep good company. From verses 10 through 14 of this passage, we're going to see that one reason we must keep good company is because it keeps us from greed, among other things. And also from verses 15 through 19 of this passage, we're going to see that another reason we must keep good company is because it keeps us from destruction. And I'll repeat those when we get into the text. But what we'll learn from our study is that we must work to keep good company and surround ourselves with people who will help us to lead lives that are more pleasing to God and will help us to follow to better follow in the example, ultimately, of our Savior, Jesus Christ. So that in mind, I think what we'll do is break this down in chunks. So if somebody wouldn't mind reading verses 10 through 14, we'll start with that. Thank you, Dean. So again, the first point as to why we should keep good company is because it keeps us from greed. Greed comes out in this text, I think. So this point begins with the Proverbs writer establishing the point in verse 10 that his son should not consent when sinners entice him. Now, when you consent to something, what does that mean? You agree with it. You agree to do it. So that's the idea here. And we notice here that the language here is a father talking to his son. And so, yes, the instruction here is that he does not want his son to give in or to agree to these sinners when they're tempting him with the things that are described in the context. And we'll look more closely at those. Now, who are sinners? Okay, we might say everyone. But who, more specifically than that, who would we describe as sinners in the world? That's it. People who aren't following God. That is the biblical definition of a sinner. People who are living in open rebellion toward God. Now, you'll hear the phrase among Christians, well, we're all sinners. Okay, maybe. But when you look at that word in the biblical definition of the context, it's someone who's living in open rebellion toward God. Looking at it from that perspective, Christians are not sinners because we are working to be faithful to God. So these are the kind of people that the Proverbs writer is talking about. When he's talking, these are people who are of immoral character, immoral, and living in open rebellion toward God. So then this father figure is encouraging his son, don't give in to these temptations that these sinners present you with. And we see that in that word, entice, which means to just lure people into something. Questions or comments on verse 10? Okay. Now, building upon that, in verses 11 through 14, the father gives an example of what these sinners would do. Now, I think the first thing that we should understand as we come to this section is that what is written in these verses, it's a scenario. It's a scenario where these sinners might tempt the son into doing something violent for the purpose of material gain. And so this is where we're going to begin to see the greed aspect of these verses come out. So, in verse 11, what are these sinners saying to the son? What's the scenario? That's it. So what's the picture being drawn there? Okay, they might put something like it's fun to do. They might be doing that. But what else is involved in the language of verse 11? Okay. Right, so they're going to sneak up on someone. So the sinners, the scenario there, telling the son, let's go hide out with the purpose of committing some violent act. And this is against an innocent person. That word is used there. And so this is where these sinners are intent on some violent act. Questions or comments on that? Sorry, we're in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 10 through and following 19. So, any other questions or comments up to this point before we get into verse 12? Okay. So, with verse 11 having been established, according to verse 12, what's their intention? And I know there's a lot of words there. But when you read that verse, what are some ideas that come to your head as far as their intention? Say that one more time, Dean. Okay, and how do we know that? Let's swallow them alive. Yeah, so they want to kill this person, is the idea. That's true, and we're going to see that here in just in the next couple of verses. So yes, the Proverbs writer is picturing these sinners as going to commit some violent act, but the intention is to kill them. And we know this because of this word Sheol. Now, can anyone tell me what Sheol refers to before I give my spiel? The grave, okay? So yeah, there might be an alternate translation and say the grave. Sheol is the Old Testament picture of Hades. It's the place of the dead. It's not necessarily heaven or hell. It's just where these people believe the dead to go. And so here the Proverbs writer is describing that these violent sinners would be people who needlessly take away innocent lives and send people to their graves. So yes, it is the killing language. Now this is further emphasized by the fact that the writer says they do this to innocent people while they are alive and whole. And that's just a way of saying that these innocent people, they're alive and in good health. When you see that word whole in this particular verse, just means they're in good health. But then their lives are suddenly taken from them by the violence of these sinners. Questions or comments on that? Okay. So continuing with what these sinners might say in their temptation towards the Son, what's their intention in all of this? According to verse 13. To get things, yeah, and they get all sorts of stuff. So this is the picture maybe of a robber goes out and kills somebody in order to take their stuff. So this is where we're seeing the greed aspect of this verse beginning to come out. Yeah, they're wanting to get this son involved in all of this. So this has the idea that the result of their violence would be that they would gain for themselves what the text calls precious wealth. And these individuals would fill their homes with what the text calls spoil. Now these words, precious, wealth, and spoil, they're parallel terms that refer to the material goods of high value. So this might be a wealthy person they're going after to get this stuff. So this is the purpose of their violence, to take from others material wealth in order to fill their own homes with it. And so it's at this point we are seeing that the violent acts are being done for the purpose of material gain. Anything else in verse 13? Questions or comments? Okay. So coming into verse 14, the Proverbs writer presents the temptation. The specific temptation these sinners would present, saying, they might say, throw in your lot with us. We shall all have one purse. And what do you hear being said there? What are they saying to the son at this point? Say that one more time, Wayne. Okay, that's part of the idea. We'll count you as equal. Anything else? Okay, we'll make them part of the gang. Any other observations? Yeah, so that goes, yeah, they're going to combine everything and share it all. Excuse me, I just need to get a drink of water. So yes, it's a statement that has the idea that these individuals are calling on the Son to join in with them. Or as Dean put it, come be part of the gang. Sandy, did you have your hand up? Well, this isn't talking about the innocent person. This is about the Son back from verse 10. They're inviting the Son to do something to the innocent person. What's that, Dean? Yeah, we could say that the Son is also an innocent person that's being tempted to join in with these people. So, yes, they'll all share among themselves this, what the text calls this one purse. So they say, throw in your lot with us. So this brings up the image of casting lots. Can anyone tell me what casting lots is about? I see it a lot in the Bible. Okay, yeah, we. Right. Yeah, in a religious context, it was a way of determining God's will. One of the most famous examples is when they were choosing Judas's replacement over in Acts. They cast lots to determine God's will. But in a non-religious context, it was a way of luck. It was the idea of luck. And today we might compare it to throwing dice. Now, this image comes up. It's the idea of joining in on an activity, but it also incorporates the idea of luck. And for what Andrea said, it was a way to determine a result, to make a decision on something. So these sinners are inviting the Son to try their luck at doing what is described in these verses, with the knowledge that the people involved would share one purse. And that comes back to what was already said. They'd share among themselves whatever was gained from these violent acts that have already been described. And so it's at this point that we see the violence of verses 11 and 12 is influenced by the greed described in verses 13 and 14. Questions or comments on verse 14? All right. So putting all this together, verses 10 through 14, the principle we should see about keeping good company is that we must keep good company because it keeps us from greed. Now, in these verses, the Proverbs writer shows us that if we surround ourselves with the wrong people, this could cause us to become violently greedy. Now, one reason that's true is because when we surround ourselves with worldly people and keep them as company, we begin to take on a worldly mindset where we begin to desire more worldly things over and above spiritual things. Now, since that's true, these verses caution us against surrounding ourselves with sinners who might tempt us to engage in activities that are not otherwise pleasing to God. And that's going to bring us into our second point. Anything else on verses 10 through 14? Okay. So this brings us to point number 2 in verses 15 through 19. We must keep good company because it keeps us from being destroyed. If somebody wouldn't mind reading verses 15 through 19 before we look at it. All right. Now, again, the point we're looking at is that we must keep good company because it keeps us from being destroyed. Now, continuing with the same context has not changed. This point is introduced with the Proverbs writer saying to his son, as we read, "Do not walk in the way with them, keep your feet from their path." Now, what is the father calling his son to do here in verse 15, or not do? Walk away. Exactly. Walk away from them. Don't follow them. And he makes that point using this image of walking. Very popular image in the Bible. So yes, it carries with it the idea that his son should not follow in their direction. Don't get on their path. Don't go the way they're going. Don't live in the same manner that they're living. Questions or comments on that? Okay. So according to verse 16, why should the son not follow in their direction? Quick to find sin and shed blood. Yeah. The reason he should not follow in the example the people has been describing is because this is the way they're living. They're quick to do evil things and to do these violent acts, some of which have been described in the context. Now, something else we should know is that the word evil in this context is a general term that refers to all things opposed to God. It's a very general term. And so we might also be able to say that the reason this father does not want his son to follow in the direction of these people is because he wants his son to lead a life that is pleasing to God and follows in the direction of God's will. Questions or comments on any of that? Okay. So, verse 17, I'll just read it again. It says, "Indeed, it is useless to spread the baited net in the sight of any bird." Now here the writer is introducing some new imagery. What's the imagery here in verse 17? What's that, Sandy? Okay. Yeah, catching birds. Any other observations? What else does he say here? Okay, setting a trap for him. Right. So this is the picture. Good points. This is the picture he's using. That of a baited net that is spread out for the purpose of catching a bird. Okay, so that we have the picture in mind. But the writer says it's useless to capture a bird in this way because, yeah, the bird is able to see the trap being set. It's not going to go into the trap when he sees it being set. But what we have to think about is how does this apply to the context? Now, there's at least two possibilities as to what the writer means by saying this to his son. Possibility number one. The first possibility is that his son will not be trapped by the individuals described in the context because he's aware of what will happen if he follows in their example. Possibility number two is that the individuals described in the context are trapping themselves in their own baited net, even though they are aware of the consequences of their actions. Anyone need me to repeat those? Okay, I just see people taking notes, so. Okay, I'll repeat both of them again. Now, there are two possibilities as to what the writer means by saying what he said. Possibility number one is that his son will not be trapped by the individuals described in the context because he's aware of what will happen if he follows in their example. The second possibility, the individuals described in the context are trapping themselves in this net, even though they're aware of the consequences of their actions. Either one is equally possible. Did you get those, Sandy? Okay. Again, either of these possibilities are equally likely because of the things that are being discussed in the context. Questions or comments on verse 17? Okay. Is it making sense? Okay. Now, whatever meaning the writer has in mind from verse 17, in verse 18, he applies the imagery and says that these sinners he has discussed lie in wait for their own blood and ambush their own lives. What do you hear him saying there? Okay, it's going to end in a bad way. So, music to our class coming in. No, that's fine. I'm just teasing. So yeah, up to this point, the writer said they're attempting to do this to others, this violence, this greed. But in reality, they're doing it to themselves. And again, this builds on verse 17, that imagery of the baited net. Again, two possibilities there. But the point he's making here in verse 18 is even though these sinners are trying to do this to others, they're in reality doing it to themselves. Now, this being the case, this tells us that the most likely meaning of verse 17 is that the writer's son is aware of what will happen if he gets involved with these individuals. As a result, it's useless for these individuals to trap the son into getting involved with their actions. Furthermore, based on what is said here in verse 18, what the sinners that have been discussed are actually doing is killing and trapping themselves in their actions. Why? Because their actions are leading them away from God. And as a result, it's ultimately useless for these individuals to set traps for others because they're only setting a trap for themselves in the way they're leading their lives. Questions, comments? Yep. That's true. They end up, one thing leads to another, they end up going down a bad path. For somebody else who sees that, realize, I don't want to go down that path, so I'm not even going to start. That's a good point. Anything else on verses 17 or 18? Okay. So verse 19 kind of sums it up. He says, so are the ways of everyone who gains by violence. It takes away the life of its possessors. What's he saying there? Okay. Yeah. That's it. And this is one statement that should remind us there's nothing wrong with having stuff. What can be wrong is how you got that stuff. So yes, he's making a summary statement. He's described violence. He's described how these people are getting their stuff. He's described what's going to happen by getting stuff that way. Now he just sums it up. This is what's going to happen to you if you gain your stuff violently. It's going to take away your life.
that, we think of it, we always think of Scrooge when we hear that word, we think of the beginning of the story, but it's a great story because it's the end of the story that matters.
Right.
And he learned about love and generosity and change.
That's true.
And, you know, so, yeah, that's, yeah, but that's what happened at the beginning of that story, is what this is talking about here.
Yeah.
You know, it's irremissible. Even if you accumulate wealth on this earth, you're insulated from real things. The question is, you got things, you don't have people.
That's right. New Testament call that the love of money. So, oh yeah. So this is what he's talking about. Anyone who violently acquires. Now Scrooge wasn't necessarily violent, but he manipulated people, and he looked behind the scenes. But still, the picture being painted here in verse 20 is, or verse 19, that those who destroy others for the purpose of material gain will themselves be destroyed by their own actions, ultimately by God. So putting verses 15 through 19 together, the principle we should see here about keeping good company, so we must keep good company because it keeps us from being destroyed. Now, verses 15 through 19, the Proverbs writer has shown that if we surround ourselves with the wrong people, it can lead to our destruction. And one reason that's true is because the wrong people ultimately lead us away from God, and that results in the destruction of our souls. And so we have to work to surround ourselves with people who will bring us closer to God and not further away from God. Any other questions or comments on verses 15 through 19? Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Gangs are a good example because that fits the imagery being used. Anything else? Okay. So when we consider everything that we've looked at from verse 10 through 19, the point we should see from these things is that we must make it a point to keep good company. Now what we've seen today shows us that we must surround ourselves with good company because it keeps us from greed and it keeps us from destruction. And with the application of that, ultimately, is that good company helps us to remain faithful to God. Now, good company helps us to remain faithful to God because when we surround ourselves with like-minded people, we're also seeking to be faithful to God. This helps us to get stronger in our faith. Another reason good company helps us to remain faithful to God is because it encourages us to follow in the example of Jesus and do what he would have us to do. Now, with that being true, we should know that surrounding ourselves with good company also involves building close relationships with people who will help us to become better servants of Christ. Anything else? All right. Matt, will you close us?